Good afternoon. Welcome to what I hope you'll find to be a very different and very enlightening webinar. Because we've had so many successful webinars with amazing turnouts since the COVID-19 pandemic, and we've had so many successful dinners, many people think that all that EMET does is host webinars and dinners. However, EMET does a great deal more than that. Every single week, one of us publishes an article that appears in a huge array of outlets, including Commentary, Mosaic, Hussein, The New Republic, Newsweek, JNS.org, Israel Hayom, the Jerusalem Post, the Times of Israel, the Washington Jewish Week, JNS.org, and the Washington Times. Having had said that, the real essence of our work is in our almost daily meetings that we've had with members of Congress, but mostly with congressional staffers that handle foreign policy. And we have not rested during the pandemic, but we have had many, many meetings. We just stopped the face-to-face visits, but we do it via Zoom or through conference calls. So today we're going to let you in on what we say behind closed doors to experience what it's like to be a congressional staffer and to hear what we have to say. I want to make clear that there is a huge array of issues that we discuss, but in the interest of time, we're just going to limit it to 2 or 3. Before we do that, I want to tell you a little bit about my really excellent, very, very highly qualified staff that I just feel blessed to have, and I love working with them every day. Benjamin Weil served in the IDF and rose to the level of a commander, where he commanded about 100 troops, and he was on every border. And after that, he worked for Minister Weil Steinitz, somebody that I feel is probably the most intelligent member of the Knesset, who's also the energy minister, and Benjamin was responsible for handling all of his foreign policy. Hussein Aboubakr Mansour grew up in Cairo in a very, very different situation than most of us have had, and I'm going to let him tell his own breathtaking story. He is remarkably intelligent for such a young man, and he has already been published in Commentary and Mosaic, and he has had the intellectual honesty and the moral courage to critically examine the culture he came from, and which led him to make some very difficult life decisions. So first of all, Benji, tell me why you feel the F-22s would make a difference in Israel's qualitative military edge. Benjamin.
Thank you, Sarah, for the question, and thank you for the audience who's tuned in. Now, when it comes to the F-22 sale to Israel, and in particular the F-35 sale to the UAE, it's important to understand the context of what these sales entail and the capabilities of an F-22 and an F-35 are, in order to understand why the sale of an F-22 to Israel may answer the QME question in regards to Israel. And over here, I'd like to take you back to the height of the Cold War and the U.S. Air Force developing a new fighter jet, of what's considered a 5th-generation stealth fighter jet, the F-22. It was the most advanced fighter jet at its time, and they completed the fighter jet after the Cold War. But more importantly, in 1998, there was a congressman by the name of Obey who, in the Defense Authorization Act, added an amendment. It was a 1-sentence amendment that prohibited the sale of that F-22 to any American ally or any other country, and limiting it only to the U.S. Military. And originally, Lockheed Martin, who produced the F-22, had in mind to sell about 5, 6, or even 700 of these in order to recoup their investments on of the development of the F-22. And instead, all they sold were about 200 to 300 of them to the US Air Force. And this is very important to understand because that's one of the reasons why the F-22 program no longer exists and was discontinued last year. And this aircraft was originally designed as an air-to-air combat fighter jet. Now, there are various fighter jets around, F-15s, F-16s, F-35s, F-22s, and more. And there are many differences between them. It's not like getting into a car and using one car, and if that breaks down, use another one. They all have different purposes and are designed to carry different munitions, and some have two engines, some only have one. So that's why the Air Force maintains a wide range of capabilities in terms of its fighter jets and their technologies. And the F-22 is designed precisely for an air-to-air fighting. Now, when it comes to the F-35 sale to the UAE, over there, Israel's has some concerns with that sale. They're not 100% happy with the U.S. going ahead with this sale. And one of the reasons for that is the Middle East is a very unpredicted region. If you look at many countries today and what they looked like 15, 20 years ago, you'll find for the good or the bad, there are drastic changes in their foreign policy and their behavior in the Middle East. Syria, Turkey, Egypt are just to name a few. And if the U.S. were to go ahead and, as they plan to, in selling these F-35s to the UAE, one of the concerns is that the UAE in 10, 15, 20 years may, but probably not, but may use those advanced fighter jets against some of their countries that are considered their allies today, but maybe their adversaries in a decade's time. Now, obviously, this is all behind closed doors. Israel does not air out its dirty laundry, especially with the U.S. But one of the ways to compensate for that QME, the qualitative military edge, which would be somewhat diminished by the sale of these advanced fighter jets to the UAE, could be the F-22 sale to Israel. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the United States is prohibited in selling the F-22 to any country. And Congressman Obi, who submitted that amendment, he had two main concerns when it came to that fighter jet. Number one, his concern was reverse engineering, where the country that would acquire the F-22 would reverse engineer the stealth capabilities of the F-22. And the second concern was selling those technologies to a third country. The F-22, I will mention, has a much superior stealth property to it than the F-35. So even though that fear still exists with the F-22, it's still relevant to the F-35 sale. And as we know, the U.S. has went ahead and sold F-35s to other countries. So clearly in the sale agreement, there are clauses that address that concern of reverse engineering the stealth capabilities of the F-35s and also selling it to a third country. So it seems as though the original concerns of Congressman Obi in regards to the F-22 may not fully be applicable or exist in today's world with if we were to apply similar measures and clause in an F-22 sale to Israel or Japan or any of other allies of the United States. And I believe that selling this F-22 to Israel would address their concerns, because if in 15 years from now, any of Israel's allies today who have F-35s would use them against Israel, an F-22 would address that exact concern of that air-to-air combat. Now, when it comes to the F-22, we have to look at the greater picture over here. And if we look around, number one, we see that the U.S. Air Force is currently looking to replace their F-22s that they have is in their fleet. And as part of this program called the Next Generation Air Dominance Program, they are developing a new fighter jet, what's called a fifth generation fighter jet. And fifth generation is a classification of fighter jets that have advanced stealth capabilities. And that means in about 5, 10 to 15 years from now, the U.S. Air Force is going to start phasing out of those F-22s. And currently, since the U.S. is not able to sell them to anyone, they'd have to get rid of them completely. So by repealing this amendment, not only would it allow the U.S. to preserve Israel's QME by selling the F-22s, it would also allow this whole win-win-win scenario materialize, where the U.S. doesn't throw out these F-22s and scrape them. Israel gets an F-22, which is a fighter jet that they've wanted for years already, and the UAE would be able to go get their F-35s from the United States. Now, I will point out that another reason why I believe that this would be an answer to that QME question is because one of the original fears was the reverse engineering, but more importantly is selling that technology to one of the US adversaries. So in today's world, that would probably be Russia or China. But has been reported actually that the Russians have just finished developing a Sukhoi 57, also a fifth generation fighter jet, which has the same stealth capabilities as the F-22, and according to some analysts, even surpasses that. And China too has their J-20 fighter jet. So that means that those original fears not only can be addressed in an agreement the same way we have done with the F-35s, but they become a little less relevant because our own adversaries already, in some degree, have those capabilities in their fighter jets as well. So they wouldn't really need the F-22 stealth technology. Now, that means that this is a matter of national security and policy concern. And when it comes to national security, again, it was reported not so long ago that the Department of Defense is neutral on repealing this law. And it seems as though it would ultimately be up to Congress and White House if they'd be interested in repealing this amendment. And again, I am not lobbying over here. I'm just trying to make the case or trying to find a solution where we'd be able to go ahead with the F-35s and address Israel's concerns and maintain their QME. And it seems that the F-22, as we phase out and not a day before, we would be able to hopefully transfer them to Israel, because I wouldn't even advocate to hurt U.S. Air Force capabilities in the pursuit of an arms sale to the UAE. And again, the UAE won't be getting the F-35s tomorrow. They'd be getting it in a couple of years. So this kind of seems to fit in perfectly, where in a couple of years from now, if we were to repeal this amendment, we would phase out of the F-22s and transfer them to Israel. At the same time, we'd also be transferring F-35s to the UAE. And hopefully, neither Israel nor the UAE would ever have to use those aircrafts, but I do believe that that would be the ultimate answer to that big question in the sale of F-35s to the UAE.
Excellent, excellent. Can you talk a little bit about the response that we've been getting on Capitol Hill for this suggestion?
Yeah, so we've been discussing this matter with congressional offices, congressmen and senators. I think this dates back to about June. Right. And at the time, not many people on Capitol Hill have even heard of this amendment or the F-22, let alone the solution of transferring F-22s to Israel. But at the beginning, many congressmen and senators were very much in favor of repealing this amendment. Again, they had to look into this a little more because it was a new concept. But then starting August time, we found that a lot of other organizations and media have picked up on this and have started reporting. So there was more information available for these offices, and that's helped us relay this message to congressional offices. And we're currently working together with a few in seeing if and how we can repeal this. And then the step after that is the actual agreement of selling. And obviously that's outside of our domain of any arms sale, but we do advocate and provide information on the F-22 and why this would be an ultimate solution.
Right, and has the Department of Defense weighed in, the Pentagon?
Yeah, so the Department of Defense they have said multiple times that they're neutral on repealing this amendment. Within the defense establishment here, I understand that there are some voices that are advocating for this repealing, and there are some voices that are saying not to, that there are reasons for Obey's amendment, and we should keep it in place. But ultimately, the the policy of the defense establishment is to remain neutral, which is why this is more a policy question and not a national defense question.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, Hussein, can you tell us a little bit about your background and about the legislative initiative that we're working on?
Definitely. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much for all the viewers who tuned into the webinar. So as you said, I'm originally from Egypt. I grew up there. I was born in 1989 to a middle-class family in Cairo, and I lived there all my life. And from a very early age, I was exposed, like everybody else, really, to the prevalent anti-Semitism that exists pretty much in every cultural venue in the Arab world, whether it was the mosque, whether it was school, whether it was official curricula, whether it was TV broadcasts. And it's just because you grew up in it, you become completely just unaware even of its existence. It's like fish in water. You learn it from a very early age. And it's the worldview of everybody, you know, even normal people who are going about their daily life. If you ask them what do they think about Jews or Israel, you'll hear horrible things, because that's also the education that they received, and that's the education that I received as well. Following 9/11, I was 12 or 13 at the time. Of course, that was a period of great tension and upheaval globally, really, and the Middle East was not an exception. After 9/11, religion became or Islam became the central object of popular discourse and culture in general, and just the rhetoric, the radical rhetoric, whether in mosques, whether on TV, whether Al Jazeera, of course, intensified heavily, which actually most likely was one of the main goals of Al Qaeda and Bin Laden to achieve, which is basically this huge propaganda for radical Islam in the region, which unfortunately was achieved. Especially if you think about the period right after 9/11, we're talking about the rise of the global war on terror, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, and at the same time, of course, you had the second Intifada in the Palestinian territories. And the name that was given at the second Intifada in the Arab world is not the second Intifada. It was the Intifada of Al-Aqsa. And that also added to the kind of Islamization of all of public issues or political issues. So you had this rising religious kind of feverish obsession with conflict all over. And I was very young at the time. A lot of people were. And unfortunately, that wave of radicalization radicalized a lot of young people. And actually, if you think about it, those people who were teenagers during that period of time, those were the young men who started ISIS and who joined all of the radical organizations in following the Arab Spring. So that specific generation was actually a subject to probably the worst mass radicalization campaign in the Middle East. And of course, it's been building up really since the 1970s and the Iranian Revolution. But truly after 9/11, it was a breaking point. And I was a part of that. So I listened about how the Zionists are conspiring with the Americans against us. I saw the terrible inflammatory images on Al Jazeera. If you remember, in the second Intifada, there was a case of the Palestinian child, Muhammad al-Dura, who was filmed, and the story was he was getting shot on purpose and murdered in cold blood by those Israeli soldiers. I can't even count the numbers that I saw this footage in slow motion on the screen with martyrdom songs playing in the background, pretty much on every single TV channel that was broadcasting at the time. And that added, of course, to my own passion and resentment and grievance. And I wanted to do something. So I became thoroughly obsessed with the Zionists and Israel and all of this. But luckily for me, I was always a nerd. So I just wanted to learn more about those evil Zionists I hate, so I just may hate them better. So I may become better at hating them than anybody else. And I started to go online and teach myself English and Hebrew. Of course, the online landscape was very, very different at the time. The internet was still pretty new. All our concerns today about the internet was not really there. So it was actually I would say it was a better environment than it is today. And I was able to find good information. I was able to teach myself a lot of things, and I was shocked to learn about a very different reality than the mythology of the Islamist movement and Arab nationalism that is just at the heart of modern Middle Eastern culture. And that shock was completely devastating, because it really it strikes at the heart of everything that I thought I knew, not just about the world, but most importantly about myself. And that's also one of the tragedies of the Arab world, that the modern identities of the inhabitants of today Middle East, the Arabs, whether they choose to identify themselves as Arabs or identify themselves primarily as Muslims, those modern identities were either formed by a very toxic movement that's called Arab nationalism, that was greatly inspired by European fascism at the beginning of the 20th century, or by the Islamist movements. So when that becomes what you think you are, when that becomes your identity, and then you realize that a lot of those narratives that you built your own personal identity on are nothing but fiction and mythology, it was really, really devastating, especially at a very young age. And it took me many years to really get over it. And eventually I started to examine the culture in Egypt and the Arab world in general, and I discovered the tragedy that is anti-Semitism, that unfortunately became truly, truly the basis of identification for a lot of people, and for the political culture itself. Anti-Semitism plays, unfortunately, in hatred towards Israel, and a very important functionality in Arab politics. It's used always to solve any crisis that people don't want to deal with. So when states face, let's say, a crisis in legitimacy, the first thing that they can reach out to help them is the hatred towards Israel and the conflict of Palestine and so on and so forth. And I discovered how it's used in that way, and it created a truly toxic culture for the entire region. And I started to talk, I was young and naive at the time, naive enough to think that I can actually talk about those issues in public. And I started talking to people, and then I did the capital sin of trying to reach out to Israelis and trying to visit the Israeli embassy in Cairo. And afterwards, of course, that brought me to the government's radar, and I started having serious problems with the security agencies in Egypt. And my family had no idea about what I was doing with my life. But of course, once the security agencies came knocking on our doors and arresting my father and interrogating him about me, my family found out, and they disowned me from the family. And I spent 2 months and a half in military detention in Egypt in 2010. That was even before the Arab Spring, during the time of Mubarak, who was a great ally to Israel and the United States. I was interrogated on the basis of being a potential Mossad agent, a Zionist spy, a Jewish convert. And I just saw how even those who work for the state are not really immune to the paranoia and anti-Semitic fantasies that they spew to the society in general. I was released in December 2010. A month later, the Arab Spring started. And of course, we're marking 10 years to the Arab Spring. It's unbelievable that it's been 10 years. It feels like yesterday. I was in the demonstrations. I was in Tahrir Square. There were a lot of hopes. And of course, I had very strong personal reasons also to participate, because I had just been released a month earlier from terrible conditions. I was beaten every day. And I just wanted to see change, like many other people. And there was a lot of hopes at the beginning, but soon after, those hopes were completely smashed by just the unforgiving political reality of Arab politics. In Egypt, an alliance between the Egyptian military and the Muslim Brotherhood started to emerge. There was a lot of talk about that the United States is overseeing this alliance at the time. And then the Muslim Brotherhood truly started to come to power, and they started to instrumentalize all of the tools that they know how to instrumentalize in order to gain political leverage in the country over the military. So, of course, religious discourse was used to motivate voters. If you vote for the Muslim Brotherhood, you're voting for Islam. If you vote if you vote for somebody else, then you're voting. And this was said. You were voting that your mother takes off her veil, which is considered like a very promiscuous and insulting things for conservative Muslims. This was actually the way that the Muslim Brotherhood was able to mobilize voters to vote for whether their constitutional reforms, the parliamentary elections, and later the presidential elections. They started to instrumentalize anti-Semitism in August 2011. There was thousands of Egyptian demonstrators who tried to attack the Israeli embassy in Cairo. You can actually find videos of this on YouTube with people with sledgehammers trying to break down the walls to lynch the few Israeli diplomats that were barricaded inside the building at the time. It would have ended in a disaster if it wasn't for the intervention of President Obama at the time. Things got worse in general, and they started having problems with the government again. And eventually, of course, I had to leave, and I was lucky enough to come to the United States. One of the best things that ever happened in my life, really, and be granted political asylum. And it's truly a pleasure and a privilege that I'm able to work with EMET and be able to still advance the things that I believe in, because I do believe that anti-Semitism and the Palestinian cause and its fiction is truly at the core of much of the political dysfunction of the Middle East. And this is, I mean, you don't need a PhD to see this. Every single malign and toxic political ideology that rose in the Middle East since the mid 20th century lift the banner of Palestine and hatred towards Israel as its main mobilizing force. This is what Arab nationalism did. This is what Nasser did in the 1960s in Egypt. This is what the Ba'ath Party did in Syria. This is what the even more terrible version of the Ba'ath Party did in Iraq under Saddam Hussein. You know, everybody remembers that in the moment of crisis, in order to save himself, Saddam fired missiles at Israel. This is what the Muslim Brotherhood did. This is what Iran is doing today. This is what Erdogan started doing. Every single toxic political idea in the Middle East uses the conflict and the hatred towards Israel as its primary vehicle to power. And there will be no stability as long as this is the case. And this is what I talk about to a lot of the congressional offices that we talk to, and we try to advance the bill. There is a bill currently in the Senate that was introduced recently by Senator Booker and Senator Portman. And that bill requires the United States Department to actually report to the U.S. Congress on instances when Arab governments actively took adverse actions to persecute people like me who are activists for normalization with Israel or trying to combat anti-Semitism. This is a very important issue, I think way more important than people realize. It's a Muslim human rights issue. We're talking about Muslim Arab activists who get persecuted because of this. And it's an urgent step towards a social progress that will no doubt inevitably affect the political culture in the region in general. The Abraham Accords are great. I've been ecstatic since it happened, but this has to be coupled. We don't want the situation to remain as it happened with Egypt. This has to be coupled with a strong push towards actual normalization of relations between people. Because what happened to me happens all the time. A few weeks ago, a teacher in Kuwait for middle school was fired from her job because she gave her students an assignment that had a map, and on the map, Israel was named. A few weeks before that, an Egyptian superstar was banned in Egypt from performing because he took a selfie with an Israeli. Before that, an Arab peace activist was arrested the next day after he had a Skype call with an Israeli peace activist. As long as Arab governments keep taking those steps, they are preventing their own people from the necessary social progress, which will ultimately be able to alienate toxic ideas, Islamism, the Muslim Brotherhood, Iranian influence. It's not, you don't need a PhD to know that an Arab who doesn't hate Israelis and who doesn't hate Jews will never join the Muslim Brotherhood, will never join an Islamist organization, will never join a terrorist group, will never be in favor of Iran, and will never be in favor of all the civil war and the madness and the lunacy that we've been seeing. And this is why this issue matters a lot, not just for Israelis, but the future of Arab societies themselves.
Wonderful. So Hussein, in a few days on January 4th, we are going to be at the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring. I know that you were there in Tahrir Square, really with so many young idealistic Egyptians who were working, to overthrow the regime and get human rights. Looking back over the last 10 years, how do you think the Arab Spring turned out? And do you believe, you could look specifically at Egypt or talk a little bit across the region.
Of course, the Arab Spring has been a huge disappointment and a great heartbreak for a lot of people, not just in those Arab societies, but also around the world. There were a lot of hopes for democracy and human rights. Throughout the 90s and the first decade of the 2000s, in Western literature, a lot was spoken about the Arab exception, that Arabs, after the fall of the Soviet Union and the push for democratization all over the world, Arabs were an exception. There seemed to be no demand on democracy or human rights in Arab societies. And when 2011 came with the Arab Springs, a lot of people started writing about how this exception proved wrong and Arabs have as much as demand for democracy. And they rushed into those assumptions. And of course, I was one of them. But of course, all of this, unfortunately, again, turned out to be wrong. We saw how many states collapsed completely. Syria today is a completely failed state. Yemen is a failed state. Libya, not to speak of Iraq. Many of those countries are actually, it's doubtful if they will continue in the future as a unified national entity, given the tribal and sectarian violence. I think Egypt was actually the lucky case. And Tunisia, along with Tunisia, but Egypt was extremely lucky. Egypt is the largest Arab country. A third of the Arabs are Egyptian. And I think the largely homogeneous population of Egypt really sheltered the country from the kind of violence that we saw in Syria or Yemen or Libya or in Iraq or what's going on today in Lebanon. But also Egypt showed us, I think, something very, very important, that if the choice is between stability and uncertain future, people will choose stability. People today in Egypt are largely, sadly, resigned to the repression and the autocracy of President Sisi because they don't trust the alternative. They don't know if the alternative is truly a change that can bring a better future. So I think we're back to square one in a lot of places, and we're even back to square -5 in a lot of other places. And hopefully the future or the next decade will bring a better hope for a lot of people who want to see change. But I think that really starts with stability.
Wonderful. Okay, we've started to get a bunch of questions in, but before we do respond to the questions, I want to ask you, Benjamin, one of the issues we've been working on is the very, very close relationship that's been developing between Maduro and Venezuela and the Islamic Republic of Iran. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yes, and this is another issue we've been tracking for God knows how long, and been developing in a very, very rapid, I would say, way. And over the years, Iran has developed a strategy in the Middle East, which in my opinion is very smart. And we kind of sense that they will implement that same strategy towards the United States in Latin America. It's a very simple one. Iran tries to push away any future conflict or war away from their borders. And one of the ways they do that is they establish all these proxies and terrorist organizations across the Middle East and use them as pawns to execute any mission or threaten their adversaries so that when the enemy strikes back, it's against that proxy and not against Iran. Their classic case of that is Hezbollah in Lebanon, but you have other organizations in Syria, many of them. You have the Hezbollah in Iraq, and you have the Houthis. And for those of you who have been following the developments today, the Houthis shot and launched a number of missiles at airports in Yemen and then at the presidential palace. So Iran uses them as it's part of their tactic to still have that ability, maintain that ability to threaten and exert their power in the region, but they don't have to bear any consequence when it comes time to retaliate. And we identified this with Latin America, where they've established very close relationships with Latin American countries over the past couple of decades, whether it's Venezuela or Colombia, to a certain degree, Argentina, Bolivia, and others. And the way they do it is very interesting. Is at the beginning, they used a secret foreign ops unit of Hezbollah and of the IRGC to tap into Middle Eastern and Persian communities in Latin America. And that's how they built their network and logistic network to operate in the three domains that Iran is known for operating in Latin America. That's money laundering, terrorist organization, and transfer of arms. And some of that also ties into drug trafficking as well to finance some of their activity. And we kind of fear that they'd use Venezuela in particular to as a launching pad to threaten the United States by positioning either long range or in particular ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, in Caracas, and thereby threatening the United States. Just to give you some context, an ICBM has about a 5,000 to 6,000 kilometer radius. So an ICBM that would be stationed in Caracas would be able to cover the entire east coast of the United States, as well as large portions of the Midwest and Southwest. And if this scenario sounds familiar, it's because it's a repeat of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I like to call it a Cuban Missile Crisis 2.0. And I don't mean to spread any fear among our audience. This is an issue that we're discussing with congressional offices in order to address. And this wouldn't be such a big concern to us if it weren't for the many of decades and years that Iran has amassed the experience and know-how of not only establishing these relationships in the Middle East and now in Latin America, but then also smuggling arms to their organizations. And over the past year, they've been defying both a set of sanctions on exports from Iran and a set of sanctions on imports to Venezuela by sending massive oil tankers across the ocean and even flying Boeing 747 cargo jumbo jets. And this is where we step in, because the current administration and previous administrations have adopted numerous policies, which are great, but clearly they're not enough if Iran is continuing smuggling in goods or smuggling out goods to and from Venezuela. We fear that on this massive oil tanker, on one of these planes, they can easily hide an ICBM or even two, if they'd like to do that. And there's no way for us to verify what's on those planes or on those ships if we don't stop them. And when it comes to a plane, unlike a ship, you can't stop it in the middle of the ocean, inspect it, and then let it continue. When it comes time to stopping a plane, there's a set protocol, a very clear protocol that the Air Force follows, which it's basically scrambling and signaling to the pilot that they should land wherever it is the Air Force wants them to land so that they can inspect the cargo. But clearly an Iranian pilot will not really cooperate with the U.S. Air Force. And if a pilot does not cooperate, short of shooting it down, there's nothing you can do. And clearly the U.S. will not be shooting down planes because of 0.0001% suspicion of a system being on board. Now, and this is where our policy recommendations come into play, because there are additional layers to what already exists. And one of them is related to our Latin American allies. One of the things we've been doing together with Israel and Europe over the past couple of years is getting European countries to recognize Hezbollah in its entirety, both its political and military arms, as a terrorist organization. And we've started doing that in Latin America, but there's so much more we could be doing. And if we continue doing that, not only will it slow down some of the Iranian activity in Latin America, because as I mentioned earlier, that's one of the ways they operate is through Hezbollah's foreign ops unit. But also, Iran disguises a lot of their illegal activity as trade and humanitarian aid. And they have numerous bilateral and multilateral trade agreements, whether it's through Mercosur, a Latin American trade bloc, or through other trade blocs that Iran is a member of, whether it's OPEC, ECO, and many others. And if we were able to first identify Hezbollah as a terrorist organization in its entirety, and then work on these trade agreements they have to identify which ones are legitimate and which ones are illegal, that would slow down Iranian activity in Latin America significantly and buy us a little time. Then that brings me to the second set of recommendations that we discussed with congressional offices. That's with our African allies. And over there, as I mentioned earlier, Iran defied two sets of sanctions by shipping their goods to Venezuela. But when it comes to airlines, in reality, they've defied three sets of sanctions, because what they tend to use is an airline that's a US sanctioned airline because they're closely associated with the IRGC. There's Mahan Air and Kashem Air. Both of them are known to be airlines that are used by the IRGC. And over here, this is a very simple policy that we can implement. And it goes as follows. A Boeing 747 has the range of about 18,000 kilometers, give or take, depending on the cargo load. The heavier it is, obviously, the shorter the range. The distance from Tehran to Caracas is about 16 to 17,000 kilometers. We work with our African allies for them to deny any access to their airspace of a US sanctioned airline or any other airline that's suspicious of engaging in terrorist activities or any illegal activities. That would force these airlines to fly around the African continent, thereby extending their trip to about 21,000 kilometers, way beyond the range of a 747. And the reason why I believe this is the most important policy recommendation, because as I mentioned earlier, planes are much trickier to get on board and track and inspect. And this would eliminate their smuggling to using ships alone. And that's why I believe it's very important. And this then now leads me to my third set of recommendations, and that is using our intelligence community. And I want to bring you back to January of 2020, the pre-pandemic era. And when it came time to assassinating Qasem Soleimani, prior to the assassination, we've used very vital intelligence and information we received from an ally who tapped into various ports across the Middle East. And that allowed us not only to gather intelligence on Qasem Soleimani's whereabouts, but also his security structure and ring and modes of transportation he prefers, or at the time of the assassination, what car he was in the motorcade, and other vital information. And if we kind of use that strategy in Iranian ports and Venezuelan ports, not only will that save our analyst community here in DC time, money, and effort in kind of finding this needle in a haystack of which ship contains a suspicious missile, etc. It would also allow our Navy in the Atlantic to prepare a very successful raid on a ship weeks in advance. And the reason why this is important, having worked for the Minister of Energy in Israel, I can tell you that oil tankers are among the biggest ships in the world. Not only are they very hard to smuggle, which Iran, with their expertise, has been able to, but even if the U.S. Navy were to get on board an Iranian oil tanker to try and find a missile, they're so big, it would take a team of the U.S. Navy days, if not weeks, to inspect the entire ship. Having this intelligence, this vital intelligence in Iranian ports or even in Venezuelan ports, and know when the cargo ship is supposed to come, that will be able to narrow down the options or be able to help our Navy identify which maybe containers to inspect or what level on the ship they can expect to find any missiles if they do find any. And this is even more important today than ever, because next year Iran is facing general elections. There's a lot of political instability within Iran, and what any successful organization or even country does is when there's a lot of instability from within, the least you can do is hold your external threats a constant. And one of the ways that Iran can do that, which the U.S. is clearly the biggest threat to Iran these days. One of the ways for them to do that is to keep America in check by having some leverage over the United States. And what better way of doing that than having a missile directed directly at the President of the United States to keep him or her in check if they even think of launching an attack against Iran, because stationing these missiles in Venezuela creates a new equation that we're not prepared for and we haven't seen, and it links Latin America to the Middle East, whereby any action we take against Iran, the nuclear program, their PGM project, the Precision Guided Munition Project, their aggression in the Straits of Hormuz, or any one of their proxies across the region, or any other activity, Iranian activity in the region, that would automatically translate to some sort of threat on the President of the United States of launching a missile, crippling the US economy by launching it at New York or whatever it might be, and vice versa. Once they station those missiles in Venezuela, and we then go and execute a mission to eliminate that threat, whether we're successful or not, that would automatically mean that Iran would retaliate against us or our allies' forces in the Middle East. And just as a side note, Iran is in advanced talks with Russia in acquiring an S-400 defense system. And earlier this year, Turkey has tested that system on American F-16 fighter jets, meaning the Russians were able to adjust the system to address the vulnerabilities of an F-16 fighter jet. And many of our allies in the region have an F-16 fighter jet. So once Iran gets this, not only would they be able to retaliate against us and our allies, but they'd even be superior in some cases. As I mentioned in my first case of the F-22 and F-35, you can't just substitute an F-16 with an F-15, where if they have the S-400, okay, we'll use another aircraft instead, because some of them can go different distances, can carry different munitions, and have different capabilities and are designed for different tasks. So Iran would definitely benefit from having the S-400, and that would limit our and our allies' activities in the region. And this is the threat that's emerging, and I don't think we have the luxury of waiting another day to address these, which is why we work day in and day out and addressing this issue and advocating on Capitol Hill and finding ways to address this issue with congressional offices.
Thank you. I'm sure by now you can see why I am so immensely proud of our team here. And now I'm going to turn the podium over to our wonderful and very capable Director of Communications, Sarah Leah Thompson. Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, we have a few questions from the audience, so we'll get through as many as we can in the time allotted. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in and to everyone who has submitted a question. The first question we have is for Hussein. As a result of the Abraham Accords, do you see any change in the Arab League's attitude towards Israel?
Yeah, definitely. Actually, there was a very meaningful meeting or incident between the Palestinian Authority and the Arab League following the signing of the Abraham Accords, where Saeb Erekat, who just passed away, kept calling the Arab League General Secretary office, calling for an emergency meeting in order to condemn the Abraham Accords. And they wouldn't even return his calls. And eventually he sent them a message saying that you would have to wait for the regular meeting a couple of months later. And then when that regular meeting happened, the representatives of the Palestinian Authority failed to pass anything that it even refers to the Abraham Accords, and the meeting went on without even commenting on it. So there is definitely a shift, and this has to do, of course, as you know, with the geopolitical situation in the region in general, that Arab governments now have much pressing priorities in terms of confronting Iran specifically and the Muslim Brotherhood than actually supporting the Palestinians or taking or fostering their cause the way they used to for decades. So there is definitely a change in the official positions. Thankfully, this change also now is led by the United Arab Emirates, who seem to have a very different agenda than the agenda that was in the region for a very long time, led by the traditional powers, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and so on. I don't want to give any false hopes. So I think it's important to know that we need to proceed with caution. There is potential, definitely. but the problems of the Middle East are not going to go away anytime soon. And as I said earlier, the issue of Palestine is the most effective ideological weapon that is used in the region in general. So unfortunately, that will keep probably the issue alive for a long time. The Palestinians, unfortunately, don't seem to be wise enough to try to end their conflict and try to stop using the support they get in the way they do. But yes, there is a shift of the positions of the Arab League, but hopefully that will be translated into a shift. Me personally, by the end of the day, I know I live in Washington D.C. and work for EMET, but I really care about the people. I care about the people who are walking on the street. I care about people like my brothers. I care about my nieces and nephews. That I want them to grow up not being victims to all of those toxic ideas. And this is ultimately the goal. So that goal is definitely achievable, but it's going to take much longer.
Thank you. The next question we have is for Ben. How does your previous experience as advisor to the Energy Minister Steinitz impact your ability to influence members of Congress?
It's an excellent question. So Minister Steinitz, in addition to being the Minister of Energy, he's also on the Security Cabinet of Israel. And having managed his international portfolio, we've worked a lot with Congress, Senate, White House, and many other offices here in DC in advancing various policies of the U.S. in the Middle East and national security interests and more. And given that the Middle East is so rich in oil and gas, energy many times ties into the national security of Middle Eastern countries. And so working with Minister Steinitz, I've, over the years, have cultivated very close relationships with some of these offices. I know the Israeli issue very well. I know U.S. interests in the region very well. And so I kind of speak the same language as many of these congressional staffers. And this not only am I building on the trust that we've developed over the years, but also sharing knowledge. And I think that's very important over here at EMET is that Sarah has been working on many issues for years and has a lot of knowledge. And in combination with Hussein and I, who have come from the Middle East and experienced it, I think that that's very, very important. And we're very unique in that sense, where we're bringing that experience and knowledge and trust to the table and know our issues very well. And we do see how when we operate with congressional offices, it results in congressional letters and amendments to legislation and new legislation because we provide all this background information and build on those layers of trust that we have.
Thank you. For the next question, how much influence / activity does the Muslim Brotherhood currently have internationally? Perhaps Hussein, you could address this.
Yeah, definitely. I think actually we're living, I mean, it's every year is historic really with the Middle East. But this is a time of a very pivotal and significant change and transformation. For years, Arab governments wanted to only contain the Muslim Brotherhood. That proved to be an extremely flawed and misguided policy because it only gave the Muslim Brotherhood a chance to really widen their popular base. And we saw that. We saw the Muslim Brotherhood rising to power in the Gaza Strip. We saw the Muslim Brotherhood rising to power, unfortunately, in Turkey, one of the most important countries in the Middle East. We saw them forging this strong alliance with the royal family of Qatar. And eventually we saw them rising to power in Egypt. So a lot of the Arab establishment has realized that this former policy was an actual disaster, it was a failure. And right now in the Middle East, the official policy, or non-official policy really, of the Arab establishments, if we're talking about Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf countries except for Qatar, is an exterminationist policy. That makes it really brutal and cruel. For example, there was one day in Egypt where the government crushed the Muslim Brotherhood demonstration, killing over 1,000 people in a matter of 2 hours. But unfortunately, it's also been quite successful in driving the Muslim Brotherhood outside of many of those countries. The Muslim Brotherhood in terms of the Middle East are now concentrated primarily in two countries, in Turkey and Qatar. A lot of them are living there basically, as refugees from the repression and other Arab governments. In Tunisia, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is in power, actually grew to fear that they have the same fate as the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. So they are trying actually to distance themselves, at least officially, from Islamism. So I would say that the Muslim Brotherhood, in terms of influence, power, is declining in the Middle East. However, the Muslim Brotherhood, as the question mentioned, became an international, it's hard to say an organization, it's really an ideological umbrella that contains a lot of separate chapters and groups. I think sadly, and I'm really not a conspiracy theorist, I'm saying this in all honesty, I think the Muslim Brotherhood today is likely to win elections, local elections in Western democracies, than they are likely to win elections in many Middle Eastern countries, which is really, really sad. So the Muslim Brotherhood, their biggest presence, as I said, outside of Turkey and Qatar would be in the US and other European countries, but that presence itself detached from the global network of the Muslim Brotherhood. There is a disintegration of the global network of the Muslim Brotherhood, and their chapters now are pretty much independent. So I think, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood in America are now like an independent Islamist American faction, and they are more invested in American power struggles and American politics than they would be in Middle Eastern politics. So I think overall, it's a positive development that the Muslim Brotherhood globally is weaker, but that means that countries will have to do independent internal efforts in order to try to fight their ideologies and influence.
Thank you. For our next question, and this could be directed to Ben, if the F-22 is so important to Israel's future security, then why hasn't Israel's Ministry of Defense lobbied hard to change the law that prohibits Israel from getting the F-22?
Great question. So I'd like to begin with sort of like international affairs, how it works. And at least Israel, when it comes to the United States, does not try to change any law or affect any internal policy. So that's one of the reasons why Ministry of Defense, MOD, or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or Prime Minister's office, they would never go to the United States and ask to change a law. What they would do, and they have done behind closed doors, is ask for an F-22, and then it would be up to the American legislators and policy teams to change any law that's required, if at all. Maybe a presidential, declaration is enough, or executive order. But Israel would never advocate or even call to change any law. The second thing that I mentioned right now is Israel has been asking for the F-22, but for various reasons. The chief one is the Obey Amendment that I mentioned. The U.S. is unable to sell F-22s to Israel right now, or even transfer them for free. And Israel's not the only country that was interested in the F-22. There's South Korea, there's Japan, and a few others. But Israel, obviously, the United States obviously has denied that any of those requests because of the Obey Amendment. But that is an issue that's been discussed.
Oh, okay, Sarleh?
Thank you. Another question. This is to Hussein. We received a comment that you're very impressive, and the question is whether or not there are any others in this younger generation who are working to bring positive change in the Arab world, and what they're organized doing. Yeah.
I think, first of all, we have to note that the Arab world in general doesn't have a culture of a civic culture of civic organizations working aside from mosques and churches and just religious organizations. So I wouldn't say that there are an emerging civic culture of people who are doing this in an organized way, but there are emerging voices of a lot of activists and a lot of writers and authors and intellectuals and thinkers that I'm actually quite impressed with, who understood that what the Middle East needs is not really political change at this moment. What is needed is social progress and religious reform. And I think overall, if this is the only result of the Arab Spring, then it was actually worth it, regardless of how high the price was. There are many thinkers today, actually from Saudi Arabia itself, from Gulf countries, from Egypt, who are starting to talk about we need a religious reform now. We need a reform to the issues of women. And I think this is a much more pressing need than any calls for democracy or elections or so on and so forth. And for me, I think also that is the most important part of human rights. Human rights is a huge set of rights. And it's really sad that even here in Washington, D.C., where people are supposed to have high degrees and be educated, whenever they talk about human rights in the Middle East, they almost reduce it, almost always, to political rights, which are a subset of human rights. There are political rights. And this is why Islamists have been able to ride this wave over and over again. And even today, you see them trying to present themselves as the advocates of human rights. They are not really advocates of human rights. They are advocates for the subset of human rights that are called political human rights, because that's what they are interested in. I'm actually not interested in that anymore at all in the Middle East. I'm interested in the rest of human rights, freedom of religion, gender equality, and so on and so forth. And there are young activists who are doing that. There are very few who are emerging in many countries who are starting to talk about the issue of anti-Semitism in Israel. This is a much more sensitive issue that many people recognize because of, just as I said earlier, unfortunately, it became an intricate part of the identity structure. So it's going to take much more work, but I'm very happy to see people who are starting to do that. And hopefully with the Abraham Accords, we will have also some official efforts from the Gulf government sponsoring this effort.
Thank you. And the last question, which perhaps Sarah, you can address, regarding the topic that Hussein just shared about the changing landscape in the Middle East, what effect have you seen on the attitudes of faculty and student bodies on campus as a result?
Unfortunately, even though in the Middle East, there's a warming of relations towards Israel, here in the United States, if you look throughout practically every single university has a very, very large student body that is extremely anti-Israel. Unfortunately, the Middle East studies departments have only fed into that. I mean, you look at Columbia University with Rashad Khalidi and Joseph Mossad. All these people are virulently against Israel. And there's been like a substitute of a real solid education for paltry propaganda. And you see Students for Justice in Palestine all over. And this is a huge problem. It's another issue that we've been working on for years and years in terms of at least working with the United States government funding these Middle Eastern studies centers throughout universities. And way back in 2008, we passed an amendment that, EMET worked very hard with Congress to pass an amendment which said that in order to get American grants, they have to show a wide range of viewpoints and a diversity of perspectives, but that's pretty much been ignored. And we worked with the Trump administration, and they actually asked the grant recipients to write an essay, or when they were applying for a grant, to write an essay showing what they do to promote a diversity of perspectives and a wide range of viewpoints. And unfortunately, they knew right away that their weak point was about Israel. So they wrote these lovely essays talking about how there's a junior year abroad program. We encourage people to go to Israel. There's faculty exchange programs. But unfortunately, the same chairman of these departments that wrote these lovely essays have also signed a statement for BDS, about half of them, not all of them. So we have a huge problem here. And we see that they have transported a lot of the hatred of Israel across the Atlantic, and they are not keeping up with the times in terms of this beautiful warming of relations with Israel that's happening in the Middle East.
Thank you. I think that's all the time we have for questions.
Wonderful. I just want to say to all of our listeners, I'm sure you are as impressed as I am with the quality of our excellent staff. And I love working with them every day. I just get this feeling that they just love their work. It's more of a passion than a job. And I am so immensely, immensely proud of them. So in your end of year giving, I really would like you to think of EMET, invest in EMET. You're investing in a quality education, not only for the community at large, but for staffers on Capitol Hill. And we really thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Thank you.